All right, what's up, everybody? My name's Dr. Mitch Schwacko. I'm a first year internal medicine resident. Today, I want to talk about this question right here. Why does my doctor want me to take a statin? Um, it's kind of something I think one of my patients asked me a couple of months ago, and um, to be honest, I knew from medical school that we use them for obvious reasons, stroke prevention, heart disease prevention, controlling cholesterol. But I wanted to take a deeper dive. In one of my weeks off, so I did, and I kind of wanted to present some of the things I found, which I thought was pretty interesting, and then kind of share it with anyone who wants to hear about it. So here we go. So we start in kind of the 1940s. After FDR passed away, there was some kind of data and health data that came out surrounding his death. And after that, there's something called the Framingham study that got started, which was a really interesting study and has been kind of groundbreaking in the whole world of medicine. So in the 1940s, not much was really known about cardiovascular disease. In fact, the term risk factor hadn't even come around at that point. And that is something that was really kind of surprising to me, because in medical school, you learn so much about risk factors, like risk factors for stroke, risk factors for having a heart attack, just risk factors in general. And then controllable risk factors, uncontrollable risk factors, those types of things. So there's I'm going to kind of touch upon a few things that the Framingham study established. There's a great review article I read in the Lancet that I attached the link right here. Credit to these authors, but I kind of want to get into it and talk about what I found. So I'll kind of read here and summarize. In the 1930s, Roosevelt's campaign office released medical records showing that his blood pressure was modest, 140 over 100. No medical intervention was taken at that time. And that's, nowadays with our new kind of conventions, we would say that's hypertension. That's high blood pressure right there. But there wasn't a great understanding of cardiovascular disease at the time. So no actions were taken. Then through the health record review, they showed that kind of between the 1935 year and 1941, his blood pressure gradually rose all the way up to the 188 over 105. Despite his rising blood pressure, his doctor at the time said he was healthy and that his blood pressure was no more than normal for someone of his age. As he traveled the world, met with world leaders, they made comments like he was a very tired man and actually go on to be admitted to the hospital in 1944 for dyspnea on exertion or shortness of breath with exertion, diaphoresis, sweating, and some abdominal distension, meaning his belly was swelling. A cardiologist who was at the time, Dr. Howard Bruin, only one of 100 in the nation, noticed that he was slightly cyanotic or blue appearing, and his blood pressure was in the 180s over 108. And that was the first time he had given the president the diagnosis of hypertension, hypertensive heart disease, and cardiac failure. Only a month later, the president's blood pressure had risen to over 240 over 130, which is exceedingly high by today's standards. Later that year, in 1945, sadly, the president passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage, or a type of stroke, and his blood pressure at the time was 300 over 190, which is kind of exceedingly high, and numbers you barely see nowadays. Then, in 1948, President Truman signed the National Heart Act, which shifted the focus of science to studying the origins of cardiovascular disease, since it seemed to be kind of ailing the entire nation, and we didn't know why. He gave a $500,000 grant, the government did, to the cause, and soon after that, the Framingham study was off the ground. So what is the Framingham study? So under the direction of the National Heart Institute, they started this project, and its objective was basically to identify common factors or characteristics that contribute to cardiovascular disease by following its development over time in a large group of participants who had not already had any symptoms of cardiovascular disease or suffered a heart attack or stroke, which are two main kind of manifestations of cardiovascular disease. So what they do, they recruited 5,200 men and women between the ages 30 and 62 from a town in Massachusetts called, Framingham. And they began their first round of physical exams, lifestyle interviews, and then would follow them every 2 years for detailed medical history, physical exam, and lab tests. This essentially was kind of what you would refer to it maybe as a prospective cohort study, where they took a cohort of individuals and followed them over time. And then after you kind of detailed their lab values and physical exam findings, you can start to infer relationships between cause and basically you can start to infer some cause and effect. Now, there's a lot of kind of historical background when I was reading about why specifically this area was chosen, and then also some of the limitations, which have tried to be addressed lately. So they actually have enrolled the offspring, like a second generation of Framingham participants in 1971. And I think they have already done a third generation as well. And now, I would be remiss not to mention that Framingham, Massachusetts is one city at one point in a time in the U.S. where there was probably not a lot of ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, racially diverse, socioeconomically diverse individuals that were studied in this specific experiment. So can it be extrapolated to large populations? Maybe. And, we've seen more and more studies that do, but that's definitely a limitation of this original study. And I want to make sure that it was mentioned. So what were the first findings? The first findings were in 1957, almost 10 years after the first participant was examined. And if you define hypertension as a systolic blood pressure greater than 160 millimeters of mercury, they found that those folks had a nearly fourfold increase in coronary heart disease incidence per 1,000. So that's pretty notable, right? And I know this presentation isn't about controlling blood pressure, but essentially everything I'm going to say about lipids and cholesterol and statins is the same kind of roots and incident findings in this Framingham study with blood pressure. In fact, probably more convincing were the findings of elevated blood pressure and its relationship to coronary heart disease and major cardiovascular events such as stroke and heart attack. Also, it was noted, as we talked about, they had been studying labs as well as physical exam and, of course, vital signs, including blood pressure. They also studied serum cholesterol levels. So they said that in this study and multiple follow-up studies, which we'll briefly touch on, showed an inverse relationship between serum HDL and coronary heart disease, as well as an association between increased LDL and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So the inverse relationship meaning essentially the lower your HDL is, the higher your risk was for CHD, and a kind of concomitant increased risk in increased LDL and increased atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So what does this mean, right? Now we've established that perhaps low HDL and high LDL are risk factors for coronary heart disease and maybe stroke. So what can we do about it? So now we enter the 1970s and we meet the Japanese microbiologist Akira Endo, who through his kind of studies, research, experiments, first discovered natural products with a powerful inhibitory effect on HMG-CoA reductase. Now this, I cite my source down here at the bottom, so these are not my original words, but he basically was fermenting this fungi or fungus, Penicillium citrinum, and he was able to isolate this product. And he, I think, is originally called compactin, which is not something we currently use, but it was the discovery was massive because now we knew, or he knew, that there was an agent that could inhibit the rate-limiting step in cholesterol biosynthesis. So there's this long, basically step-by-step biochemical pathway that results in the production of cholesterol in pretty much every cell. And knowing that you can inhibit it, well, obviously that would have kind of massive consequences. So now that we've successfully isolated a product, they called it compactin, that would inhibit this step in cholesterol production kind of from a natural source, it would make sense that we would try to see how it works. And now, to my understanding, compactin itself, this first one that was isolated, didn't have an excellent safety profile, so it wasn't kind of produced at scale, but cousins of it from maybe other fungi or other, I guess, compounds did do well, and that's when we start to see the class of statins come to be and kind of its subsequent studies on them. So they first began studies of statins, which their mechanism is to block HMG-CoA reductase, as we learned about in the last slide. So they first studied healthy volunteers in the 1980s and noted that it dramatically lowered LDL cholesterol in healthy volunteers. Then in 1982, small-scale trials with lovastatin studying folks with severe heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, that's a mouthful, refractory to existing therapies, resulted in dramatic reductions in LDL as well. So this is essentially a subset of patients or folks who have built-in issues in their kind of biochemical pathways, which result in extremely elevated levels beyond normal of LDL cholesterol. Okay, so those are a few studies, but what else? What else can we, hang our kind of hats on as showing good results? So again, there have been numerous landmark trials demonstrating statins' efficacy in reducing cardiovascular events. One of them was this 4S study, the Scandinavian simvastatin survival study. They have a lot of tongue twisters, which was one of the first major trials that showed that simvastatin significantly reduced mortality and coronary events in patients with high cholesterol and established coronary heart disease. And this study was published in the 90s. So, main takeaways, this is a lot of text, but I'll try to summarize it. They enrolled patients with established CHD by either having had the diagnosis of angina or kind of classical cardiac chest pain or a history of an acute myocardial infarction or a heart attack, who also had serum cholesterol levels between 213 and 310 milligrams per deciliter. And what did it show? Well, it showed a reduction in total mortality. It showed that simvastatin itself reduced the risk of mortality by 30% compared to the placebo. And they accredited this decrease in mortality to a reduction in coronary heart disease mortality, because total mortality, right, doesn't only include mortality by heart disease, but when they kind of studied it closer, they noticed that 42% of the reduction was due to coronary heart disease. It also showed a 34% reduction in the incidence of major coronary events, including non-fatal MIs and coronary death in the simvastatin group compared with placebo. And all these p-values really mean is that it was statistically significant by our current standards. And what else did it show? Which is not surprising, a decrease in LDL by 35%. Moreover, these large-scale studies, a few of which I've listed here, and kind of after reading through this AHA article I found, they also included stroke as a secondary endpoint to a lot of these studies. So a secondary endpoint is essentially when let's say you're making an experiment and you want to say, I want to see if simvastatin reduces total mortality, which was the case in the 4S study. You can kind of stratify the results by other endpoints, and one of them could be stroke rate. So you can examine the stroke rate in your placebo group versus your treatment group. And what did they find? They basically found that in the control group, these are all percentages, by the way, and I didn't include kind of the time to follow up, but you can review them if you'd like. Within the set time of the study in the control group, 4.3% of folks suffered a stroke, and in the statin group, 2.7%. And were these differences statistically significant? Yes, they were. In all four of these studies, which were huge, large-scale studies examining the primary endpoints as listed. So not only do we see now that statins are able to decrease the risk of major coronary heart disease in folks with established coronary heart disease, prior MI, but now in these studies as well, we've seen a statistically significant decrease in stroke rate. Now, I haven't personally reviewed with granularity every single one of these studies, so I don't know, the population, and obviously it's hard to extrapolate findings from a study to a specific person. So I'm not trying to be prescriptive at all. I just am trying to review the data for myself and see kind of why we, have the practice measures we do in place right now. So with all that said, kind of an interesting kind of historical, just grazing the surface review of not only statins, but the Framingham study, which every time I read about it is more and more interesting. And we have to give some credit to those who came before us to have the patience and wherewithal to think about studying people years and years and years ahead just to find these risk factors, which we know are now they're controllable. You know, we can control someone's cholesterol with medications, lifestyle. You can control your blood pressure with lifestyle changes, certain medications. It's very interesting to me, and that's why I like medicine. It's learning the history of it has made it more interesting for me as well. But of course, you know, the decision to stop or start a medication, I'm not trying to be prescriptive at all. It should be made by you and your physician. Everyone's experience and scenario is totally different. And there's also, you know, a limitation of this video in itself is that there's so much more being discovered daily with regard to CHD, lipidology. I mean, there are lipid specialists who would probably watch this video and kind of laugh at it about how simple I'm being. But honestly, the reason, you know, I kind of made this is I enjoyed digging into the history of statins, wanted to share some of it. Maybe in the future, I'll talk some about hypertension or elevated blood pressure and why that's important to control. But overall, you know, hope you guys enjoyed. It's not medical advice, and of course, none of these views or statements reflect those of my employer. Again, I'm just kind of happy to put something out there. If anyone you know, wants to learn about it, and maybe I'll be back with another video. Thank you guys. And of course, here are my sources. I tried to embed some links as I went through. Want to give credit where credit's due. I kind of looked through some of these websites to find what I talked about today. Appreciate it.